What's up guys, me, I'm doing another Call of Duty Black Ops 4 video, and today's video we are going to be talking about what the launch times are for PC, when the preload starts for PC, and about the PC minimum and recommended specs, and everything about PC in this video. So, I already covered everything about Xbox and PS4 in a separate video that I uploaded late last night, so if you guys haven't checked that video out, you guys can do so on screen. But this is going to be a separate video entirely for PC, so if you're interested in Xbox or PS4, then I already made a video about that. Like I said, you guys can go and check that out. But this is for all those PC players out there who are looking for the minimum specs, the recommended specs, and also what time you'll be able to preload, and also what time the game's actually going to be playable. So the first things that we're going to look at is all the specs and everything that you're going to need physically for your hardware, for your computer, in order to play the game. And yeah, so first up, the minimum specs for your operating system, you're going to have Windows 7 or higher, and that's a 64-bit version of it. So, I mean, that's pretty simple. I mean, like, I don't know why anybody would be using, like, Windows XP to run this game, or really any game, but CPU is an Intel i3 4340 CPU, or an AMD FX 6300 equivalent. So that is a pretty low-end CPU from many years ago, and then just 8 gigabytes of RAM is the minimum, so not too bad there. That's a pretty standard computer. But for your graphics card, you're gonna need a GTX 660 2 gigabyte, or the new, like, 10th generation one would be a GTX 1050 2 gigabytes, or a Radeon HD 7950 2 gigabyte equivalent. So basically anything like that, any of these super low end, like, kind of budget cards will work. And I'm sure, like, anything really from the 7th generation of cards or the 9th generation would work. Like a 960, I'm sure would prove to be good for minimum specs. But for the recommended specs here, this is just recommended to be able to play the game. Really, I mean, the minimum is going to give you maybe like 720p, with like really low settings. That's minimum to play. That's not recommended at all. That's not, you're not going to have a great experience. But for the recommended, once again, for the OS, this one's a little bit different. Windows 10 64-bit instead of like Windows 7 or Windows 8. So then the CPU is an i5 2500K or Ryzen R5 1600X equivalent. So basically an i5 here, whereas the minimum was an i3 or the AMD equivalent of that. Recommended is 12 gigabytes of RAM, so an extra 4 gig up from the minimum. So I mean, that makes sense. 12 gig isn't too hard to come by, but if you only have 8, I'm sure you'll do just fine. And then for your graphics card, you're gonna need a 970 4 gigabyte or a 1060 6 gigabyte, or a for the AMD side is a Radeon R9 390 or an RX 580. So that's the recommended, basically probably for you to get to like 1080p, mostly around like high settings and stuff like that. But then we have some like a little bit other specs here. So we have high refresh and then ultra specs and stuff. So this is kind of cool that they kind of detailed some of these things too, because most times they just go minimum, recommended, and the recommended is is like the mid-range cards, and then the minimum is like, oh, you basically just have to have a computer that has been built within the past like 5 years to be able to play this game at all. But now we actually get some specific things as to like how you're able to get high refresh, or how you're able to get like ultra like tier graphics and stuff. So for the high refresh slash like competitive, so this is like if you want to play at like 144 hertz, if you have like a really high refresh monitor, and this is for 1080p is what they said here, but I'm sure you could probably crank it up to 1440p and you'd be just fine. But your OS, Windows 10 64-bit, CPU an i7 8700K.